Uh, Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. The United States has exercised global leadership since World War II, and General Marshall was certainly one of the principal founding fathers of that global leadership. But when the Cold War ended, the nature and the purpose of American global leadership changed. How it changed and why and what the consequences were are the subjects of my remarks this morning. And they are also the subjects of my recently published and even more recently mentioned book, Mission Failure: America and the World in the Post-Cold War Era. That book is a history of American foreign policy between the years 1993 and 2014. But it is also an argument about that period. It's a history with a thesis or with an argument. So I'll begin with the thesis of the book. It can be summarized in 5 propositions. The first proposition is that the years in question constitute an unusual, perhaps unique period in the history of American foreign policy, and even arguably an unusual, perhaps unique period in the history of all great powers. The reason is that during this period, the United States faced no serious security threats. And that meant that the usual business of foreign policy, and certainly the business of American foreign policy in the Cold War, dealing with the external policies of strong states, was suspended. It gave the United States unusually wide latitude in choosing the foreign policies to carry out. And that brings me to the second proposition. In this period, the United States chose to carry out a foreign policy that is sometimes misleadingly called nation building. I say misleadingly because what the United States was attempting to do really consisted of 2 distinct, although closely related, undertakings. One was properly called nation building, that is, trying to create a sense of nationhood, of common allegiance, common culture among disparate peoples. The other, equally important and closely related but distinct, is properly called state building, meaning establishing the institutions of modern governance where they do not exist. That is to say, the main business of the United States in the post-Cold War era was conducting missions of transformation in other societies. Third, this policy of attempting missions of transformation was practiced by all 3 presidential administrations in this period, those of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And missions of transformation excuse me, were common to American policies in and toward China, Russia, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the wider Arab world. Now, in none of these cases did the American government start off its engagement with the intention to carry out missions of transformation. There were other motives initially, but that is where each of these engagements ended up. Fourth proposition. All of these disparate missions had the same outcome. They all failed, hence the title of the book, Mission Failure. It's sometimes suggested that the United States had some experience in successful missions of transformation after World War II, specifically with the cases of Germany and Japan. But these missions were distinctly different because the conditions were radically different. Note that in Germany and Japan, and also in the rest of Western Europe via the Marshall Plan, the United States was engaging in neither nation building nor state building. Germany, Japan, and the countries of Western Europe were already nations. Germans felt themselves to be Germans and citizens of Germany. Japanese felt themselves to be Japanese and citizens of Japan. Moreover, each of them already had a well-established, powerful, highly competent government. That, after all, was what enabled the two of them to come close to conquering Europe and Asia, respectively. The United States had no need to do state building. And there is a third difference between the post-1945 cases and the ones that the United States attempted in the post-Cold War era that is important. In Germany and Japan, and in Western Europe as a whole, the United States, after the war, was able to maintain an American military presence in these countries, which helped keep the countries on the path toward democracy, but was able to do so, indeed keeps them there in some numbers to the present day, because these American troops were not regarded by the people of these countries as an occupying force, but rather as a force defending them against external enemies. That condition was not present in the American missions in the post-Cold War era. Fifth, and finally, in the post-Cold War period, whereas the United States attempted these missions, that period has now come to an end. It's come to an end because its defining characteristic, the absence of serious security challenges, now no longer obtains. There are now new security challenges. We are in a new, if you will, post-Cold War world, and I'll say more about that later in my remarks. But I turn now to some of the specific cases. The missions of transformation began with the advent of the Clinton administration and its policy toward China. That initial policy, some of you may recall, was one of linkage. The Clinton administration linked trade with China to improvements in the Chinese government's performance on human rights. Specifically, the administration said that if China did not improve its performance on human rights, it would be denied access to the American market. Now, this counts as a mission of transformation because if the Chinese government had changed its policy and begun to respect and honor human rights, that would have transformed the Chinese political system. It would no longer have been an orthodox communist political autocracy. So if the policy of linkage had worked, it would have transformed China politically. But, of course, it did not work. The Chinese flatly rejected the policy of linkage, and the Clinton administration abandoned it. In fact, it shifted its China policy 180 degrees, partly under the influence of American business people who were very unhappy at the prospect of being shut out of the China market. Coming into office, proclaiming that denying trade to the communist regime in China would be the way to make it politically more liberal, the Clinton administration decided that, to the contrary, More trade was what would liberalize China, and that became the Clinton-China policy. The administration had more success initially in Russia. Russia's first post-communist leader, Boris Yeltsin, wanted to establish a democratic political system and implant a free market economy in his country, and he at first welcomed American assistance. Russia does have a rough and ready free market economy, although with an unusually large state-controlled sector and riddled by corruption. Still, it does have a market economy. But in the political arena, the initial steps taken toward political democracy under Yeltsin have been reversed, eliminated by his successor, Vladimir Putin. Now, the United States is not responsible for the failure of democracy in Russia. The two principal reasons for its failure, in my judgment, are first, the Russian political tradition, the political experience of Russia throughout the decades and centuries, of which democracy was not even a small part, and second, Russia's unusually beneficent, generous, large energy resources. These energy resources and the income that they brought have enabled Putin and his colleagues to monopolize power while repressing some opposition and bribing the rest of the population. Russia now resembles other countries, many of them in the Middle East, that depend on energy exports and are usually called petrostates. The United States did, however, make one serious mistake with Russia that contributed to the kind of foreign policy that Russia now carries out. This was the ill-advised decision to expand the Western military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, eastward to include first former communist countries and then former provinces of the Soviet Union itself. The United States undertook this expansion despite having given verbal promises to Soviet and Russian leaders that such a thing would not take place, and over the objections of all Russians, including the most liberal ones, the ones most closely associated with democracy, free markets, and pro-American policies, who feared, rightly, that they would be discredited by this policy. This policy and a series of other policies that the Russians regarded as contrary to their interests and undertaken without consulting them turned the Russian political class and ultimately the Russian public in an anti-Western, anti-American direction. It made anti-Western policy the default mode of Russia's foreign policy, and it helped create the political climate in which Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, thereby putting a definitive end to the post-Cold War era. The Clinton administration, of course, never considered using force against China and Russia, two large nuclear-armed countries, but it did undertake military intervention of one kind or another in Somalia, in Haiti, in Bosnia, and in Kosovo. And these military interventions represented an innovation in American foreign policy. For the United States was using military force not for the traditional purpose of defending American interests, but rather to promote American values. Specifically, it was attempting to protect the citizens of these places against the depredations, the aggression, the persecution of their governments. In a military sense, these interventions succeeded. The United States did, in the end, succeed in bringing to an end the attacks on civilians. But the Clinton administration also promised to turn these places into democratic, peaceful, and prosperous countries. And in no case was this accomplished. The missions of nation building and state building failed in the places where humanitarian intervention took place. Then came the attacks of September 11th, 2001. This was a traumatic experience for the United States, and it led the United States to engage in 3 conflicts, 3 wars that it would not otherwise have waged: the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq. In Afghanistan, the familiar pattern repeated itself. The American military easily deposed the Taliban regime, which had played host to the organization Al-Qaeda that had launched the attacks of September 11th. And the United States, along with other Western countries, installed a new government in Afghanistan that showed promise of presiding over a decent, quasi-democratic country with consistent economic growth. But the Taliban returned in the form of an insurgency that continues to the present day, and it's now not clear whether the American-installed and American-supported government will be able to survive the withdrawal of all American troops. Iraq is the most contentious, the most expensive, and ultimately the most unpopular example of a mission of transformation by the United States in the post-Cold War era. Iraq followed the familiar pattern. The military succeeded. Saddam Hussein was removed, but then the United States did not succeed in establishing a coherent sense of nationhood among the different peoples of Iraq, nor in building a modern government. Another somewhat older familiar pattern repeated itself in Iraq as well. This was a pattern seen in the wars in Korea and Vietnam. In all 3 cases, at the outset of American military engagement, these wars enjoyed considerable support in the American public. But in all 3 cases, as the wars proceeded, the popularity waned. The wars and the administrations conducting them became unpopular. In all 3 cases, the American public never turned against the goals for which these wars were being waged. Americans consistently said that it would be a good thing to remove Saddam Hussein and install a decent pro-Western government in Iraq. But in all 3 cases, the war became unpopular because of mounting American casualties. Americans believed that the goals for which all 3 wars were being waged were worthy ones, but they concluded that the price that the United States was paying in order to achieve those goals was too high, was excessive, and they wanted the wars stopped. And in all 3 cases, in all 3 cases, the war ended. In the latter 2, by the withdrawal of American forces. So Americans care about the cost of foreign policy, especially the cost of wars. And for the American public, the cost of wars is measured in American casualties. Now, the Iraq War is recent, and yet it has given rise to a number of myths, or at least misunderstandings. The most prominent of these is the charge that the George W. Bush administration lied, deliberately misled the American public about the presence of weapons of mass destruction in order to gain support for military intervention in Iraq. At anti-war rallies, the cry, "Bush lied, people died was often heard. In fact, he did not lie. He and his colleagues, and indeed most of the American intelligence community, genuinely believed that Saddam had retained weapons of mass destruction contrary to numerous United Nations resolutions. And the leadership and intelligence communities of other Western countries, some of whom actually opposed the American intervention in Iraq, also believed this. There have been a number of careful studies that have concluded that this was an honest mistake. If you consider it a mistake, it was certainly honest. There are three other myths or misunderstandings that I think are worth noting. One is that the presence, or at least the believed presence, of weapons of mass destruction was at the heart of the American intervention, that it was the main reason that the United States went to war to remove Saddam Hussein. It was a reason. It was certainly given as a reason, but it really wasn't all that important. And we can see this in two ways. First, the weapons of mass destruction in question, the weapons that the Bush administration genuinely believed Saddam had retained, were chemical weapons. Chemical weapons are classed with nuclear weapons as weapons of mass destruction, and they are certainly unconventional weapons, but chemical weapons are far less destructive than nuclear weapons. In fact, there are many countries around the world, some of them hostile to the United States, that either have or could easily make chemical weapons that have never been proposed as the objects of American military intervention for that reason. Second, the presence and or absence of weapons of mass destruction really had relatively little to do with the political course of the war in the United States. It was American casualties that determined public attitudes, not the fact that chemical weapons were not found. Indeed, I would argue that if chemical weapons had been found, but the war had taken the course that it did with increasing American casualties, it would have become just as unpopular. Whereas, on the other hand, if weapons of mass destruction had not been found, but the war and its aftermath had gone as smoothly as the Bush administration hoped and expected, with most of the troops back in the United States by the fall, the war and the administration conducting it would not have become remotely as unpopular as they did. Second myth or misunderstanding or exaggeration, the view that the decisions made by Ambassador Jerry Bremer at the outset of his tenure as head of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq in the spring of 2003, fatally poisoned, decisively undermined the American effort in Iraq, and if only different decisions had been made, things would have gone much more smoothly. The decisions that have come in for greatest criticism are ones that he made almost immediately upon arrival in Baghdad, and without consulting widely, or perhaps even at all, certainly not consulting with the military leadership there. He decided to disband the Iraqi army. He decreed that members of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist Party would not be allowed to serve in the post-war government. And he decided not to stand up an interim Iraqi government immediately, that is, a government composed of Iraqis, but rather to govern the country directly by himself with other Americans. Now, there's no doubt that these decisions had adverse consequences. Disbanding the Iraqi army, for example, created a pretty large pool of Iraqi men with military training, with weaponry, who were unemployed and angry. That certainly did not assist the American effort when the war was over, or at least when Saddam had been deposed. On the other hand, it is perfectly possible, indeed I would say likely, that alternative decisions would have created just as much trouble for the United States and maybe even more. After all, as we learn, the Iraqi regime was essentially a government of the minority Sunni Arab Muslims controlling a country in which the Shia Arab Muslims were the majority but had no power, and indeed, after 1991, were suppressed and repressed by Saddam's regime. The instruments of government in Iraq were the instruments for carrying out this suppression and repression. The army and the bureaucracy were in very large part organizations designed to perpetuate Sunni rule at the expense of the Shia. So if the United States had decided to keep them in being, this might have had a disastrous effect on the Shia. The Shia, who constitute upwards of 65% of the Iraqi population, made relatively little trouble for the United States. Not none at all, but less than did the Sunnis. But if the army and the Ba'athist bureaucracy had been reconstituted, that might have turned the Shia decisively against the United States, and their resistance might have been just as costly as that of the Sunnis. Final myth. The argument heard with some frequency in this election year that the United States had won the war in Iraq, had pacified Iraq with the surge, but then President Obama threw away these gains by withdrawing American troops from Iraq. Well, the surge certainly enjoyed some success. It helped to pacify Sunni areas of Iraq, and it did so because the Sunnis had grown, at best, tired of the jihadis in their midst who were helping them oppose the American occupation, and were ready to cooperate with the United States in getting rid of these people. But the architects of the surge were always clear that ultimate success depended on reconciliation between the Sunni and Shia communities. And that, in turn, depended on the pursuit of conciliatory policies by the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad, led by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Well, Maliki, as we know, pursued the opposite of conciliatory policies, policies that discriminated against and in some cases persecuted the Sunnis. They turned against him, rejected Shia rule in Baghdad, which created the political climate in which the Islamic State was able to establish and perpetuate itself. Now, it is surely the case that had the United States retained a military force in Iraq rather than withdrawing completely, this would have given the United States more leverage in that country. But my own judgment, and it's merely a judgment, and there are people in this audience who would have a stronger basis in personal experience for making this judgment, but it's my judgment that in order to have enough political leverage in Iraq to make sure that the Sunnis did not become disaffected and did not support jihadis again, the United States would have had to leave a substantial military contingent in Iraq. A contingent substantial enough that it would have continued to take casualties. And a contingent that large, one that continued to take casualties, was politically impossible in the United States. The American public had rejected it decisively in 2006, and no president could have carried out such a policy. I believe that even if Senator McCain had been elected president in 2008 and had been inclined to keep a contingent of American troops in Iraq. And remember that it was the Bush administration that had agreed with the Iraqi government on a timetable for total withdrawal. But even if Senator McCain or President McCain had tried to abandon that timetable, American politics would not have permitted it. Well, even as it was failing to bring democracy to Iraq, the Bush administration launched an initiative to try to bring our form of government to the Middle East as a whole. This was the Bush Democracy Initiative, and that too failed. But a few years later, in 2011, the Arab Spring broke out. And it seemed, for a brief, shining moment, that the Arab peoples would do for themselves what the United States had been unable to do. That is, bring democracy to Middle Eastern countries that had never known it. Alas, as we know, the Arab Spring ended largely in tears. Most of the countries where it took place, where uprisings took place, now have repressive governments or civil wars, or sometimes both. Well, I said at the outset of my remarks that the post-Cold War era is now at an end, and it has ended because its defining condition no longer exists. The United States is not free of serious security challenges. Indeed, there are such challenges in three crucial parts of the world. In Eastern Europe, such a challenge is posed by Russia's aggressive foreign policy, and in particular, its invasion and occupation of neighboring Ukraine. In Asia, in the Western Pacific, the security challenge comes from China's increasingly aggressive maritime policies. In the Middle East, the challenge comes from Iran and its efforts to dominate the region through its policies in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and through its pursuit, we hope now at least interrupted, of nuclear weapons. So the United States is no longer living in the post-Cold War era. It no longer has the condition that permitted a concentration on missions of transformation. We are in a new world, and one that calls for a new foreign policy on the part of the United States. What could and should such a new foreign policy be? Well, if the American foreign policy, the American role in the world that was carried out since World War II were to be continued, the new conditions would seem to call for a renewal and adaptation in these three theaters of the familiar Cold War policy of deterrence. Now, this is not the Cold War. Conditions have changed. The policy of deterring the Soviet Union in its particulars would not be appropriate for dealing with post-communist Russia, with China, and with Iran. But still, since these are so-called revisionist powers, powers that seek to upset the status quo in these three regions, and since the United States is the defender of the status quo, the obvious step for the United States is to take the lead along with regional coalitions made up of regional allies in preventing these three revisionist powers from overturning the status quo. Will the United States carry out such a policy? Well, it seems to me that the present presidential cycle, due perhaps mercifully to end next Tuesday, offers evidence that the United States may not adopt such a policy, may not continue the kinds of policies that have become familiar and normal since World War II, may not take up once again the mantle and the burden of global leadership. Why do I say this? Well, let's step back for a moment and consider what the United States did in the world after World War II. There were two major undertakings on the part of the United States. One was to serve as a mainstay, perhaps the mainstay, of an open international economic order. The other was to serve as a mainstay, perhaps the mainstay, of a global security order. The United States had a particular instrument for each of these. In the economic realm, it was America's policy of open trade. In the security arena, it was America's system of alliances. But in this presidential cycle, both have come under pretty severe criticism. For America's trade policy, the Republican nominee, Mr. Trump, has made it clear that he regards virtually every trade agreement ever signed as bad for the United States. And the runner-up for the Democratic presidential nomination, Senator Sanders, echoed his sentiments, took basically the same position, and got enough support within the Democratic Party that the Democratic nominee, Secretary Clinton, abandoned her general support for free trade and came out against the pending free trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As for America's alliances, Mr. Trump, who seems to regard alliances as akin to real estate transactions, which are no good unless you come out ahead financially, has criticized them on precisely the grounds that the United States has not benefited on what he considers the bottom line. But on the other side of the aisle, President Obama as well has been critical of our allies. In his widely noticed interview in the Atlantic Monthly last spring, he criticized America's European allies as free riders. Now, this is not the first time that the main lines of American foreign policy have come under criticism in a presidential election. In 1972, Senator George McGovern, the Democratic nominee, made as one of his campaign slogans, "Come home, America," referring, of course, to the Vietnam War. And in 1952, one of the two principal contenders for the Republican presidential nomination was Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, who had opposed in Congress both the Marshall Plan and American membership in NATO. But, as we know, McGovern was decisively defeated by the staunchly internationalist Richard Nixon, and Taft was defeated for the nomination by General Dwight Eisenhower, who had been the supreme Allied commander in Europe during World War II, who adopted the Truman administration's internationalist policies and gave them a bipartisan cast. What's different then in 2016? Well, it seems to me that three things are different. First, both America's instrument in the economic sphere and its instrument in the security sphere have come under criticism, not just one, but both. Second, they both have come under criticism not from one political party, but from both of them. Third, and perhaps most important, nobody is defending these policies. So I conclude that the next president of the United States will have two related tasks. First, deciding what American foreign policy should be in this new world. And second, and not less difficult, trying to promote adequate American public support for the policies that he or she chooses. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for some questions. What I ask you to do, if you have a question, please stand up, state your name, where you're from. We'll pass the microphone to you, and please address it to Dr. Mandelbaum.
General Jumper.
Sir, John Jumper, sir, VMI Board of Visitors. On your position on the decisions of Mr. Bremer, I'm one that tends to disagree with that. But I do agree with you to the extent that if those were decisions taken in isolation to disband the Iraqi army, to not do business with the Baathists, I understand your argument. But if it had also been done with a view toward a more humanitarian approach to our strategy at the time, in other words, a strategy that was more aimed at making the life of the average Iraqi person, family, better than it was before, then I would say that disbanding the Iraqi army, 150,000 angry young men who were considered heroes by their population because of the war with Iran, hastened the transition to an insurgency. And the decision about the Baathists was one that was similar to World War II. We're not going to do business with Nazis when everybody was a Nazi. They kept the trains running and the electricity on. Electricity is a poor example for Iraq, I understand. But I just wonder if it had had an effect on the overall strategy, would you feel the same way about it?
Well, it's a good question, and of course, we'll never know what would have happened under different circumstances, and General Jumper had a ringside seat for this, so your opinion carries a lot of weight. I would say that, I should say at the outset of my answer that my judgment, it's only a judgment, is that Iraq was mission impossible, that it really could not have gone well enough to be considered a success no matter what the United States did, or at least no matter what the United States feasibly could have done. But that's a judgment, and we'll never know, and others may have other judgments. Two problems here. First, you can't provide services without security, and there was no security almost immediately. So there would have had to be a much larger American troop presence, especially in the Sunni areas. Now, if the original war plan that it had troops coming through Turkey had been possible, and it would have left some American troops there, maybe things would have been different. The fact that you could only come from the south meant that the Sunni areas, which became the hotbeds of resistance, were not touched. But I think without security, pretty difficult to provide for the population. And it was the lack of security that sabotaged all the infrastructure projects. So could there have been greater security? Well, here again, I see two problems. Maybe there could have been. But first, you would have needed a lot more American troops. And I do not think, although, General, you're certainly in a position now, I don't think there were enough American troops. You would have had to pull them out of places that the civilian command rightly did not want to pull them out of. And you would have had to resume the draft, which nobody wanted, which it would have taken too long anyway. You remember the exchange, it wasn't a direct exchange, between General Shinseki and my friend and former dean, Paul Wolfowitz, before the war, when General Shinseki was asked, who was Chief of Staff of the Army, how many troops would be needed after the war. And I forget what number he said, 150,000, 200,000, something like that. And that was a kind of form book answer. That was based on the metric that is common in the American government about the ratio of troops to population in post-conflict situations. But General Shinseki wasn't being anything other than normal, standard. And Paul was asked about that. He said, that's ridiculous. There's no way that it would take more troops to pacify Iraq after Saddam was removed than it would take to remove Saddam. But of course, it did, and that was no secret. Why did the Bush administration reject what General Shinseki said and what lots of people were telling him inside and outside the government, that the post-conflict reconstruction would be difficult, time-consuming, violent, and it would need a serious commitment? I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that the administration was told all this, or certainly had access, ready access to this information. My suspicion, and it's only a suspicion, and it's kind of armchair psychologizing, so take it for what it's worth, maybe nothing, is that the administration, from the president on down, civilian leadership, really wanted to remove Saddam and thought it was terribly important. And if they had acknowledged that it would have taken twice as many troops as they were prepared to devote to the mission, they couldn't have done it. So they chose not to believe that that many troops would have been required. There's another what if here. The Europeans generally, with of course with the exception of the British, the Europeans didn't make much of a military contribution, and the two of the three most important European countries, namely France and Germany, along with Britain, the three most important, opposed the war. And they accused the United States of unilateralism. My counterfactual here is that if the Europeans, all of whom thought that Saddam was a problem and all of whom believed he was in violation of the UN resolutions, had come to President Bush and said, we don't think this is the right time to invade. We think here are the steps we think need to be taken. Here's the time that we think is necessary. And if you will follow what we prescribe, we promise that in the event that it does become necessary to invade Iraq, we will supply 150,000 troops. Under those circumstances, I don't think any president could have resisted the suggestion. But of course, the Europeans did not make that promise, and the reason, or at least one reason they didn't make the promise, is that they couldn't make it. They didn't have among them 150,000 combat-ready troops. So one of the problems with American foreign policy in the post-Cold War era, and it may be a serious problem in the post-Cold War era, is the feebleness of the Europeans. These are wealthy countries. Some of them have great military traditions. In the case of Germany, probably too great. And yet, they've become basically demilitarized. Had it been different in 2003, then things might conceivably have taken a different course. So those are my reasons for concluding that it was mission impossible, but I could be wrong. We'll never know.
My question is regarding refugees specifically. Do you think the refugee situation resulting from the conflict in Asia, Africa, and in the Middle East are likely to change American policy? And specifically, if there's perhaps a humanitarian tipping point that may affect U.S. public support for specific greater action.
Very good question. Incidentally, the view that the humanitarian tragedies that unfolded on American television screens in the 1990s created irresistible public pressure for humanitarian intervention is not correct. The American public never pressed for or even supported in the majority any of the humanitarian interventions. These were not undertaken because of irresistible public pressure. But we do have another humanitarian disaster in Syria, and that is not now, and by now, it's not simply a humanitarian issue. It's a strategic issue because it is disrupting Europe, which is a vital American interest. And the prospect of refugees, the prospect of growing numbers of refugees, is part of our future. Not only refugees from conflict zones, but refugees from failed or even very poor states. Libya is now a failed state. It's basically, it basically has an open border to the south. And so hundreds of thousands of economic refugees from sub-Saharan Africa are coming through Libya, crossing the Mediterranean to go to Europe, and that's only going to increase. So migration, refugees, economic refugees, political refugees are a growing problem, and for geographic reasons, as well as economic ones, the problem for Europe, and Europe is an American interest. So now the solution to this problem is to keep these people at home by making their home countries decent places to live. But that brings us back to nation and state building, something that we don't know how to do. So it is a serious problem and a dilemma. The first piece that was written about mission failure was written by Tom Friedman of the New York Times, who's a friend and sometime co-author. And he said, in essence, well, Mandelbaum shows that we can't do nation building. But what if we have to? And I think that's an important question. And my flip response to that question, what if we have to, is, well, that would require another book, and I'm not a person qualified to write it. But you raise a genuinely important issue. Ironically, I believe that in the post-Cold War era, we could have just avoided, paid no attention to, stayed out of the places where the United States intervened. The Balkans was a refugee problem for Europe, or for Germany and Switzerland, but it didn't really present a serious threat, nor did Haiti, although it did present the prospect of refugees coming to the United States, to which Bill Clinton was sensitive because he'd been defeated for governor of Arkansas in 1980 because his state took too many, in the minds of the voters, people from the Marielito exodus from Cuba. But I don't think that the circumstances that the United States intervened to fix in the post-Cold War era rose to the level of real national interest, security interest. But I'm not sure you can say that going forward about Syria, or indeed about other refugee flows to come. And what you do about them, I don't know.
Let me ask you a question. You kind of alluded to it, but I would like to ask it more. You seem to suggest that American policies in the post-Cold War area created conditions that are not very pleasant out there. And then basically we have three threats that are emerging that weren't there previously: China, Iran, and Russia. And that really we're in a situation where we have to retreat to defensible lines. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but where do you see the defensible lines on the geopolitical level now, given that it's not the same as it was in the post-Cold War era?
Well, I think that the United States ought to take the lead in putting in place policies of deterrence in Eastern Europe and in East Asia and in the Persian Gulf. And to some extent, the United States is already doing that. That requires it may require somewhat robust military presence, but certainly in East Asia and the Middle East, it's an air and naval presence, not a ground presence. So I think that can be done, and I think if it's done properly without without troops on the ground, without nation building, and with the active cooperation of friendly countries in the region, and there's an asterisk there because coalitions are always problematical. I remember that line from General Gavin in World War II. After I'd fought as a member of a coalition, I lost all respect for Napoleon. Because Napoleon's great achievement was to overcome 3 coalitions until he was finally defeated by the 4th. And when General Gavin saw what it was like to fight in coalition in World War II, he decided that Napoleon might have had an easier task than he thought. So all of these coalitions are in different ways problematical, but that's always true. I think it can be done without straining American resources. But I don't know that that is the case, and that brings me back to the last part of my remarks. The public may not be willing to support the kind of forward policy that the United States has carried out to the benefit, in my judgment, of both the United States and the world as a whole going forward. Just don't know. Is that responsive?
We have time for one more question.
Okay, I think I got it. Yes, sir, Bob Castle from the United States Military Academy, West Point. I'd like to offer a different perspective of the residual force at the end of Iraq and its impact on Iraqi governments, if I could. So bring you all the way back to 2005. In 2005, at the provincial elections, the Sunnis elected not to participate whatsoever. After that, you had the awakening. And the key thing in the awakening was the rise up of moderate Sunnis that rejected violent extremists and the denial of the safe haven for the violent extremists. So you had the Sons of Iraq, but you had tribal Sunnis who rejected the extremist activity, the Sharia law, and they also denied safety. With the surge that came on top of the awakening, we as a kill mechanism were able to at least deny the rest of the Islamic State foot soldiers, and they retreated and went back over to Syria. During that particular time, a lot of the radical leadership was captured and went to Camp Bucca. 2009, you had the provincial elections, 4 years later, and the Sunni participation in the provincial elections was very significant, even more so than what the Shia had participated. In 2010, you had the parliamentary elections, and the parliamentary elections were successful as far as voter participation, Sunni voter participation was concerned. And then in 2011, you probably had for the first time Sunni representation in governance, in representative governance, that for the first time you had generations of differences that were being resolved with representative governance. The same can be made for the Kurd area as well, within that divide as well. So my point is that it was not so much that the residual force was going to provide for security as it was going to provide for maintaining a representative government in place. So when we left on the 15th of December, we left Baghdad on the 15th of December, and Baghdad started to get bombed again after a year and a half of not being bombed. Right afterwards, both a couple days later and then also right around Christmas time. What you had at that point was a Maliki government that was very nervous on how they were going to be providing for the security of Baghdad. When we left a huge void, and our Iranian influence into the Maliki government was significant. And the Iranian influence was such to a point that it changed representative governance of Nur al-Maliki to become an authoritative. And when he was authoritative, he went to arrest the Sunni vice president, then he went to arrest the Sunni deputy prime minister and the Sunni finance minister. So all the Sunni leadership that was at the parliamentary level became rejected. And then a whole series of circumstances occurred at that point. When the Sunni leadership at the parliamentary level was rejected, then what happened with the Sunni tribal leaders is that you created the wedge between the Shia government and the Sunnis, and you really created the conditions that were back in place in 2005. Safe haven was now granted. The foot soldiers from Syria returned. And by the way, all of Camp Bucca, when the U.S. forces left, all of Camp Bucca was turned over to the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government judicial said that it has to be evidentiary in order to maintain them in prison. They didn't have that evidence. So all of the radical leadership was then released. So you had a surge of radical leadership, you had the return of the foot soldiers, and you had the tribal leaders creating safe haven, and you had the rebirth of ISIS all over again. If the U.S. forces had, so my point is, if U.S. forces had remained, the thought was that you would have at least kept the radical, the Maliki leadership becoming representative to avoid as much as possible the influx of Iranian influence and you would have had Sunni participation, and the conditions that were in place in 2011 would have sustained itself. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that proposition.
Yes, well, you were there, General, so your perspective carries great weight, and for that reason, probably greater than mine, because I've just followed it through reading about it. I think we would agree that the crucial issue here was the policies of the Maliki government and of Maliki himself. And if it had been possible to restrain those policies, then things might not have gone the way they did. But that raises a number of questions. First, how many American troops would have been necessary to exert that kind of leverage on Maliki? Second, how long would they have had to stay? Third, could they have avoided casualties that would have made the demand for withdrawal even greater in the United States? And remember that by 2008, by the election, it was settled that the United States was going to withdraw because President Bush had signed on to it, and Senator Obama had been for it, and Senator McCain didn't actively oppose it. Then there is the issue of the Shia government. Nouri al-Maliki had spent his entire life his entire adult life as an underground Shia religious opponent of the regime. He'd spent time in Iran and in Syria, got along with the Americans, not clear he ever trusted the Americans, and there was an enormous Iranian influence, but also the ideology of Nouri al-Maliki was basically Shia supremacy. So he was pointed in that direction. And the Shia leadership, that is the members of the religious parties who dominated the legislature, were pointed in that direction. That was their inclination. They would have had to be restrained. A larger, longer American presence certainly would have served as a counterweight. Whether it would have been an effective counterweight and for how long, we simply don't know. But as I say, I'm skeptical that a continuing American presence was politically viable in the United States or even in Iraq, because as you know well, General, when the negotiations over the status of forces agreement took place, which it was never concluded, and that was the rationale on the American side for getting out, although clearly the Obama administration wanted to get out. But the Iraqis were not interested, or not, they certainly weren't willing to go very far to give us a status of forces agreement that we could live with. And I think that was a testimony both to their ideology, to what they thought they were about, and also to some extent to the political climate, at least among their constituents. So I go back to my original point. We don't know what would have happened if things had been different. And it's possible that the rise of the Islamic State could have been prevented by a sufficiently robust, sufficiently enduring American presence. We'll never know.
Right. Let's have a hand for Dr. Mandelbaum.
Thank you.
Dr. Mandelbaum, I'd like to thank you. You've had a sweeping tour de force here of the post-Cold War era, and what we should be able to draw out of your great presentation is the difficulty that strategic leaders have, especially when dealing with foreign policy, of translating strategic vision into execution, at least execution in the way you'd want. Sir, on behalf of the superintendent, the Corps of Cadets, staff and faculty, thank you very much for coming. please accept this small token of appreciation.
Pleasure. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.